And we are live here on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. What is up, guys? Nick Scripp on the P2W Fantasy Podcast, the first official show of the 2022 NFL season, as we have an actual football game tomorrow. The Bills versus the Rams. So fucking excited. I can't piece it together just because there's been so much talk of football the last X amount of months. I've said this before, I never stopped producing some sort of content. So the fact that we can stop predicting the future and actually talk about what happens is just massive for content creators. But I know we're all excited for the NFL games that kick off as NFL fans, as fantasy football fans. And I'm excited to start this week one show for you guys here today. And what we're going to be talking about is some of my favorite starts that I think will beat their projections. And then we'll have another piece of the show that we will get into. But as always, to begin, this podcast is partnered up with the Fantasy Points Media Group, which is a branch of fantasypoints.com. Go check out fantasypoints.com. They produce nonstop media content, written content through articles. They have weekly rankings and projections. They have advanced data to check out. Everything you would be looking for when it comes to football, specifically fantasy football, is in one spot. Go sign up today, fantasypoints.com/subscribe. Use my promo code P2W22 for a discount. Excited for the show. Let's get it, guys.
I play to win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best, don't trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Oh, play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win.
We're going to have two pieces of this episode. The first piece is going to be my week one start. So guys that I like, that I feel like can beat their current projections. So I'm not going to say the most obvious of starts. I'm not going to say make sure you start Justin Herbert and Christian McCaffrey and Justin Jefferson. I'm going to have a little bit of depth to these pieces. I'm going to go through each position. At the end of the show, I'm going to go into each game very briefly and say what I am looking for fantasy in each of those games. But let's kick things off with the week one starts for the quarterback position. So the first guy I want to bring up is Derek Carr, who is being started right now in 35% of sleeper leagues. So he's not even above that 50% mark. He's going against the Chargers. So last year in both matchups, Derek Carr, he threw for under 200 passing yards, but he did throw a pair of touchdowns in each of those games. The receiving core was sketchy last season. We just had Hunter Renfrow at times, who had a phenomenal season, but Derek Carr didn't have a ton of options. Darren Waller, for instance, only played in 11 games. He was still the QB12 for fantasy last season. He was top 5 in passing yards, air yards, and via player profiler, he was number 2 in accuracy rating. Now we're looking at this 2022 core of Josh Jacobs still there, Devontae Adams, his former college wide receiver, still who people refer to as the best wide receiver in the league. We see all these videos of Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase giving Cooper Kupp, giving their top 5. What do they have in common? Everybody lists Devontae Adams as number 1. He is now on the Raiders. Darren Waller hopefully is healthy, and Hunter Renfrow, who had a great season in 2021. He's like the third option in this offense, which I think says a lot for Derek Carr and is a big boost for him. So the Raiders eliminated the Chargers from appearing in the playoffs last season. I expect this to be a game where both quarterbacks are pass heavy. I truly believe that. 3 games last season in 2021, Carr had 43 plus passing attempts. Week 1, he had 56 against Baltimore. The Chargers last season were the second most pass-heavy team in the NFL. Justin Herbert had the second most passing attempts behind Tom Brady. I think this is a game where both teams are going to try to push the ball down the field, and seeing Derek Carr have this core and being in a game script where I think he's going to have to air it out a bit, I like him as a start this week in week 1. Maybe some will say it's a tougher matchup against the Chargers, but I do think that if you don't have somebody that's an elite option, Derek Carr would be a guy I'm comfortable starting. The second quarterback I want to talk about, Jameis Winston, who is being started in 15% of sleeper leagues versus the Falcons. So we have seen Winston's passing upside for yards and touchdowns in the past. Obviously in Tampa Bay, he had that massive touchdown and interception season. He was a top 4 quarterback for fantasy that year. I believe that was 2019. We caught a glimpse of some upside in 2021 for the Saints. In 2021, he played 6 full games. In 3 of those games, he was a top 15 quarterback. And in 2 of those games, he was a top 5 quarterback. In 2 of those specific games, he had 3+ passing touchdowns, which to me screams upside. 14 touchdowns in 7 total games for Jameis Winston in 2021. And that was a very different receiving core for the Saints. In 2022, you have a receiving core of Alvin Kamara, who you have to mention as a receiver on this team. Hopefully, it's not solidified yet if he's going to be a go or not, but hopefully Michael Thomas, first-round draft pick Chris Olave, and Jarvis Landry. That is a very different core than last season, where a guy like Marquez Callaway was getting a big load of targets in this offense. So to me, we've seen the Saints in the past be a little bit conservative with the passing game, specifically with Jameis Winston, but I don't think that they build this receiving core for them to be very conservative. You don't go and draft a Chris Olave in the first round and then make sure you grab another veteran wide receiver in Jarvis Landry in this offseason just to say, hey, we're going to run the ball and establish some short yarder opportunities, and we're going to be very conservative. I actually think they are going to open things up this season for Jameis Winston. I don't think he's going to be, YOLOing it down the field like he did in Tampa Bay. But if that healthy core is there, I like Jameis Winston this season as a guy that you can stream versus the Falcons. I think it's a decent matchup too. Again, depending on what other quarterbacks you are rostering right now. So keep that in mind for this stream. I might say, hey, Jameis Winston's a good start. It doesn't mean go and bench Patrick Mahomes. It just kind of depends on your team, your format. Maybe you're in a league that has 2 quarterbacks that can be started, super flex, or just 2 quarterback league, or an OP league. Maybe you're in a league where you punted the quarterback position. You have a bunch of flyers right now. So quarterbacks, Derek Carr, Jameis Winston, I like them in this week 1. Shifting over to the running back position now. So I have 2 guys to consider this week. 64% and 77% started. So again, we can say, hey, everybody's starting this guy, or we can say, hey, some teams are pretty deep for the running back position. Maybe this guy is a guy they were juggling if they want to flex or not. I actually had a question regarding this first player on my fantasy point stream that basically said, hey, should I flex this guy this week? So it's very roster dependent when it comes to who we are playing and when we are making these decisions. But A.J. Dillon, 64% started in sleeper redraft leagues versus the Vikings. So whenever I on the stream talk about defenses from last year, you have to understand that things change in the offseason. People get healthy. There's additions made through free agency in the draft. But I still think it's important to say, hey, this system or this team gave up X amount of receiving, passing, whatever the case is, yards this past season. So the Vikings are the matchup for the Green Bay Packers. The Vikings gave up the 7th most rushing yards per game in 2021. So just making that note there. The last time I checked Sleeper on some of these players, trying to find some player news, Alan Lazard for week 1, his status is to be determined. Christian Watson, he's been sitting out. I think his status for week 1 is kind of up in the air right now. Same with Robert Tonyan. These are 3 guys that you might have expected to have some good involvement in the passing game after the draft. Now we're questioning if Lazard, Watson, and Tonyan will even play in this matchup. So that leaves Sammy Watkins, Romeo Doubs, and Randall Cobb for the receiving core. So I'm not going to say they won't pass the ball, but I would not be surprised that if they truly lean on the pass catching ability of Aaron Jones, who I think is a phenomenal play this week just because of these pass catchers being banged up, and A.J. Dillon just pounding the rock. I would not be surprised if Green Bay really pushes the run game this week along with the pass catching game out of their 2 running backs. So I think this week is a good week for both A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones. I feel like this season they're going to utilize both running backs in very unique ways. I'm not going to say A.J. Dillon won't catch the ball. I'm not going to say Aaron Jones won't run the ball. I think they are going to utilize them to what they are very good at and intermix some roles here. But I like A.J. Dillon in this matchup versus the Vikings. And he is not a handcuff running back. And he's not just a compliment. He has very standalone value for this 2022 NFL season. And I think his projection for this week, he beats it in this Vikings game. The second running back I want to talk about is Elijah Mitchell versus my Bears. So I can sit here and try to have some bias and say the Bears D and Roquan Smith's going to lock it down and shut down Elijah Mitchell. But I'm putting the fan base aside. Elijah Mitchell is being started in 77% of sleeper redraft leagues right now. So this past season, games played with 55% or more of the snaps, he averaged 16.37 fantasy points. Very good for a rookie that many of us did not expect to even play last season. 44% of these games, he was a top 12 running back. 66% of these games, he was a top 15 running back. Where you drafted him in this redraft season, he was not being drafted as a top 15 running back. That's for sure. But we've seen plenty of that last season. Could we see a more conservative approach for Trey Lance in this first game versus Chicago? I think that's a realistic chance there, that they don't say, hey, Trey, we're going to give you the ball and we're going to have you pass the ball, 35 to 40 times in your first full start. I'm not going to say they're going to restrict him a ton against Chicago, but I think that if they can establish the run in this game and then utilize their receiving core the same way they utilize them under Jimmy Garoppolo, which is put the ball in their hands, have them provide those yards after catch. We've seen last season George Kittle, Debo, and Ayuk all be very, very good for their position in yards after the catch. So keep an eye on Mitchell. Right now he's listed as questionable, but flashback to last season versus the Bears, here was his stat line. 18 carries for 137 rushing yards and a touchdown last season, 19.7 fantasy points. He absolutely tore up Chicago. I like him if he is healthy in this game, so keep an eye on that. I think he should be good to go if he's healthy to get plenty of carries in this game. I would say expect him to get 18 to 22 carries against Chicago. I would not be surprised if he has a ton of volume in this specific game. So A.J. Dillon, Elijah Mitchell, two guys I like for this coming week. Let's go over to the wide receiver position. Got guys in the comments. Martin, Lorenzo Guerrero. Hi, Nick. You're my idol. Oh, appreciate it. Appreciate it. All right. Week one starts, wide receiver position. Deepest position in all of fantasy. I don't care what anybody says. Deepest position in all of fantasy. So plenty of guys to choose from. I tried for the wide receiver position to do, a couple guys that were not the most obvious. So some of these guys you might say, hey, everybody's starting them. But others you might say, hey, they're a guy I'm juggling flexing this week. The first one, Marquis Brown on the Cardinals now, being started in 85% of sleeper leagues, so in most leagues, versus the Chiefs. I like Marquis Brown this week. The Chiefs were sixth in yards given up through the air per game in 2021. So without digging, I would just say the Chiefs, is that because they had a poor secondary or they were bad in pass coverage, or was it just like the nature of playing Patrick Mahomes? I'm not sure, but I know that going into this game, we have the first opportunity to see Kyler Murray with Marquis Brown, who were college teammates. So they already have a connection. In 2018 at Oklahoma, Hollywood Brown racked up 1,318 receiving yards and 10 touchdowns in 12 games with Kyler as his quarterback. So an obvious connection back in college. Last season, Hopkins had 64 targets in 10 games played. Christian Kirk, who is now with the Jaguars, had 103 targets during the 2021 NFL season. Hopkins is suspended. He's not going to play for 6 weeks. And like I said before, Kirk is out in Jacksonville now. Ertz is questionable as of this podcast. I do believe he returned to practice. He's been dealing with a calf injury, so keep an eye on Ertz. I'm not going to say it changes anything for starting Marquis Brown this week, but it might be even more of a push for his role if Ertz is not to suit up in this game. I would not be surprised if Hollywood Brown doesn't gets 10-plus targets like he did 7 times last season in Baltimore in this game against the Chiefs. We talk too often and maybe overstress like, hey, shootouts and high-flying games. But when you play the Chiefs, I think you expect that sort of game script. And I expect Marquis Brown to be a huge part of the Arizona Cardinals game plan. So again, I expect to see Marquis Brown getting 10 or more targets in this game. We've seen it happen plenty of times last season, and I think it's the matchup you're going to see him go off, especially seeing it's his first ever game in Arizona with his former college quarterback. Second guy on the list here, Christian Kirk, who I just mentioned on the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's being started in 33% of sleeper leagues, so under 50% right now, versus the Commanders. So the Commanders gave up the fourth most passing yards per game in 2021. Trevor Lawrence was number 8 in air yards last season. This guy signed a 4-year, $72 million contract, which shocked the world that he got paid that amount of money to go from Arizona to Jacksonville. We wouldn't think that Christian Kirk would be one of the highest paid wide receivers in the NFL, but here we are. So best believe he's going to be forced into action in this game, Christian Kirk. 982 receiving yards last season. He had 7 games with 70-plus receiving yards, 3 with 91-plus. He was number 14 in yards per target last season. So we're looking to see Trevor Lawrence take a jump from that rookie season to that sophomore season. We're looking to see who he is going to have a clear-cut connection with. Is it going to be Christian Kirk? Is it going to be Marvin Jones Jr., Zay Jones, Evan Ingram? Like, who is it going to be in Jacksonville? My money would be with the guy they gave the money to, which is Christian Kirk, who we saw plenty of good games with last season in Arizona. I think this is a nice matchup for him to have a big splash game in his first game with the Jaguars. Last one on my list here, and I promise I've been talking about this guy throughout the entire offseason, and I sound like I'm being repetitive, but this is going to be my one Elijah Moore week. And here's why for Elijah Moore, who's being started in 59% of sleeper leagues. He's playing the Baltimore Ravens, which you might say, hey, that's a tough matchup. But last season, they gave up the most passing yards per game. So I will say that's an asterisk next to that, just because they had a bunch of guys banged up in their secondary. They had a lot of injuries for their defense in 2021. But we have Joe Flacco as the starter week 1. It's looking like Flacco is going to be the starter. Saleh said through the Pittsburgh game, I think for at least the first 4 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. Here's what Elijah Moore did with Joe Flacco last season in Flacco's one full start. 11 targets. He caught 8 of them. He went for 141 receiving yards, and he scored a touchdown. Massive week for Elijah Moore, who was hyper-targeted by Joe Flacco. So he has some familiarity with Joe Flacco. I think Flacco will have some trust in Elijah Moore. I know Garrett Wilson is there, and he is a very talented rookie, but we're talking about a guy still learning, right, in the NFL, versus a guy that had a huge game last year with Joe Flacco where he was hyper-targeted, 11 targets. That's solid. So I like Elijah Moore versus Baltimore this week. Keep an eye on the Lamar Jackson news, just as a side note. When you listen to this podcast, we may be way beyond that, but it sounded like Lamar Jackson said he is giving the Ravens until Friday to figure it out for his contract, which if for some reason it doesn't play, man, I might be putting my money on the Jets. I don't know. That's interesting. But Elijah Moore versus Baltimore, like the connection with Flacco. Love what he did last season at the pinpoint of him going off. I think it was 7 through 13 those weeks. I'm starting him where I have him. My last wide receiver, Jahan Dotson, another guy I've been talking about all offseason, nonstop. He is only being started in 5% of sleeper leagues. So this is more of a flex play. And it really depends, again, on your roster size. So if you ever are like juggling guys and you want to shoot me, an @ on Twitter and say, hey, what do you think about Dotson or this guy? I'll give you, my honest opinion on that. But we mentioned Kirk versus the Commanders. I'm going to mention Dotson versus the Jaguars. So first round draft pick for the Commanders, number 18 in receiving yards, number 12 in receptions, and tied for number 8 in receiving touchdowns in all of college football. Last season, he went 91 receptions for 1,182 receiving yards and 12 touchdowns. His final season at Penn State, he averaged 98.5 yards per game. He had one of the best dominator ratings in this class. And Matt Harmon's reception perception, he said that Dotson had the best hands in the draft class with the lowest drop rate and ranked 4th in contested catch rate. He also noted that he was the best zone beater in the class with a 96 percentile success rate. So I think Dotson having that catch and run playmaking ability with solid speed, first round draft pick, which a lot of people tend to forget about Dotson. he also has been one of the preseason all-stars. We've seen so many camp clips of Jahan Dotson balling out. I think he established a connection with Carson Wentz. I think the coaching staff like him as well. So you can hate on Carson Wentz and maybe their system and this and that, but I think against Jacksonville, this is a plus matchup for Jahan Dotson to have his first real NFL game and it to be a good one that is worth a flex play here. Going over to the tight end position now. So I have two guys for you. David Njoku, he's only being started in 17% of sleeper leagues versus Carolina. I don't mind throwing a dart on a super athletic tight end stepping into a starter role with the opportunity for volume. Has anybody really established themselves as the clear-cut number 2 in the passing game for the Cleveland Browns? David Bell, rookie that, had a nice profile, is drafted there. Donovan Peoples-Jones had some splash plays last year inconsistently. Anthony Schwartz is a track running wide receiver as well. David Njoku, I think, has every opportunity to be the number 2 target in this offense behind Amari Cooper, especially seeing Jacoby Brissett under center, who many have noted hyper-targeted Mike Gesicki in Miami at times. So it looks like Jacoby Brissett has previously preferred his tight end. It looks like David Njoku should be a focal point of this offense, especially seeing his early involvement in the preseason with the first team. So David Njoku, stupid athletic tight end. I think he can see some decent targets in this game against Carolina. I think he is a dart throw tight end start if, again, you don't have one of those top-tier tight ends. Another guy I like is Austin Hooper. He's 8% started in the sleeper app versus the New York Giants. So Hooper has had a history of fantasy relevance when he was back in Atlanta as a top 6 tight end for 2 seasons there. He dropped off in Cleveland. Now he lands in Tennessee with the Titans. There's been reports that Tannehill's connection with Hooper is there and that he preferred Hooper early on. I think there's a chance that he could see volume early in the season with Treylon Burks still learning and Robert Woods coming off an ACL recovery. So Woods, a lot of people will say, looks like he's good to go. And I think he is, listed as healthy, but coming off of that ACL, is he 100% Robert Woods, or is he like 90 or 80 or 75? I'm not going to go on a limb and say he's not going to play a lot or anything like that, but I don't know if he's 100%. And then I just saw my buddy Connor Allen online tweet something along the lines of Treylon Burks' receiving prop keeps dropping, and it dropped for week 1. So sometimes when the betting in Las Vegas gets involved with player props, they know some things that maybe we all don't. So I'm not going to say Treylon Burks is a bust. I'm not going to say that he's not going to, even have a potentially good week 1. But I think with him being a rookie, still learning the system, still learning the playbook, just still learning in general. And I think with Robert Woods maybe being at 90 instead of 100 or 85 instead of 100%, I think Austin Hooper can be a beneficiary of some targets in this offense for week 1 against the Giants. And again, very lowly started. He's not highly rostered either for redraft. So those are some of my starts that I like this week. It's easy to name the big dogs, and I try to have a mixture of guys, even though I talked about some of my my guys that I talk about too often. But for this next one, or this last segment of the show, week 1 games, what I am looking for. So let's take a look at all of the games, and I will tell you briefly what I am looking for that I feel like is important for fantasy football. So Philadelphia versus Detroit we'll talk about first. I'm going to talk about the Bills-Rams at some point tomorrow, and by the time you listen to this podcast, that game might be over, so I'm going to skip over that. Philadelphia versus Detroit. I want to see what the Hurts to A.J. Brown connection looks like. San Francisco versus Chicago. I want to see what the Fields featured playbook looks like, because we didn't see that last year from Matt Nagy. Pittsburgh versus the Bengals. Mitch Trubisky and how he works this offense. That's what I'm going to be looking for. New England versus Miami. Who gets what in the Patriots receiving core? I've said plenty of times I think Devontae Parker can be the wide receiver 1. A lot of people say I'm stupid and it's Jacoby Myers. And other people like myself say, hey, Kendrick Bourne's a sleeper. I want to see what it looks like as far as where those targets are actually going. Cleveland versus Carolina. Baker to DJ Moore. I want to know what that is looking like. How does that connection look like? What are the targets looking like? Because that's very important for fantasy. Indianapolis versus the Texans. Who gets what behind Brandon Cooks? I've been pushing Nico Collins. We know that Brevin Jordan is a tight end that, had some decent weeks last year. 50% of his games played. He was a top 12 tight end. What does that look like behind Cooks? New Orleans versus Atlanta. London's first game. I want to see how London looks in his first game pending health. How do him and Pitts coexist on the field together? Baltimore versus the Jets. What does Breece Hall's total touches look like? We've seen the reports about Michael Carter, possibly being the running back one. What does Breece Hall's total touches actually look like? Jacksonville versus Washington. Who gets what from Trevor Lawrence? So again, some of these are vague, but I want to see how some of these teams operate. Who is the primary target? Where do the targets go? What do guys do with those targets? So it's important to me. Green Bay versus Minnesota. I want to see the involvement in this new Kevin O'Connell offense in Minnesota for guys like KJ Osborne and Irv Smith. What do they look like with Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen? New York Giants versus Tennessee Titans. Who will be the alpha wide receiver of this game in general? So anybody from the Giants, is it Tony? Is it Wan'Dale Robinson? Is it Kenny Galladay, which we all doubt? For the Titans, is it Treylon Burks? Is it Robert Woods? Who is going to be the alpha wide receiver in this game? I think it's just up in the air. Las Vegas versus the Chargers. So the Raiders versus the Chargers. I want to see Palmer's involvement and who leads the team in targets for the Chargers. We've seen all these takes about Mike Williams taking over as the one in this offense. A lot of people still are firmly in on Keenan Allen. Is Joshua Palmer going to earn himself a consistent role in this offense? There's a lot to go around in terms of passing volume. Gerald Everett's there, so it'll be interesting to see how the system operates. I know it's super vague to say, but again, I think there's guys that can be very fantasy relevant outside of just Eckler, Mike Williams, and Keenan Allen. Kansas City versus Arizona. Who looks like a Mahomes favorite outside of Kelsey? Is it going to be Juju? Is it going to be Sky Moore? Is it going to be Mecole Hardman? Is it going to be MVS? I'm going to say it's not going to be the last two guys. It's going to be one of the other two guys. My bet is on Juju, but we'll see. We'll see. Tampa Bay versus Dallas. How does Tampa Bay's offense operate with the new additions? So Russell Gage added. Chris Godwin looks like he's healthy and playing. I don't know at what percent. Mike Evans should be out there. Julio Jones is there. Does Cameron Brate get involved? Is it Kyle Rudolph? Like all these moving pieces for this offense, I'm very curious to see how it looks and who is impactful outside of Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Denver versus Seattle. So that's the Monday game. Who is Russ's preferred target? It's been like the big debate of all, the offseason, since everybody thinks that it can't be a successful, two wide receiver team, which I think it can be. I think Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton will both be very fantasy relevant and have good seasons. I prefer Jerry Jeudy. A lot of other people prefer Cortland Sutton. I want to see who Russ prefers and if there's a clear separation between who is getting what targets in that system. But that'll do it for this episode, guys. I'll be dropping stuff all week. I'll be live on the Fantasy Points stream this Sunday with my guy Major, but just expect me to have plenty of audio content throughout the entire season, along with infographics and written stuff, and I'm just going to be grinding. So if you catch this episode, make sure you are following me on Twitter at P2W Fantasy. Subscribe to this podcast. I'm going to help you play to win this season. Thanks, guys.